Okay. Um, just thanks for coming out, everybody. We really appreciate this. Just a reminder, so this is the third time that Will has spoken at the series. This has really been a real blessing to me as Will stops by our office, and then we have coffee and chat about Christian history and things that we both find very interesting. And, you know, there's a circle of people that find that interesting, but not quite as interesting as Will and I. So it's been great to just start this. I mean, he enjoys doing the research. I enjoy doing the listening, and we're all happier for it. We found out last time that these make for good YouTube videos, so that's why we continue to do it in this format. So the last ones we had have at least a couple hundred views, so we're seeing this more as an opportunity for Will to do these live, but more importantly to get them on YouTube, and then we can kind of lump them together so you have this long, pretty in-depth history of Christianity, which obviously encompasses a lot of years, 2000 to be exact. So that's what we're doing again tonight. So we talked a couple months ago about what we thought would be the next step after our discussions on the creation of the New Testament canon and some of the biblical writings. And we thought this would be a really crucial point in Christianity, and I think he's right, which is that late 3rd century kind of where Christianity was still very much a minority religion and still very persecuted. And then the huge switch when Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and what that meant for Christianity and what it still means. So tonight is about those martyrs and the persecution of Christianity. Tomorrow will be about a very different topic and the conversion of Constantine. So I don't want to say anything more than that, except for we're grateful to have Will back again. He and his wife are parishioners here at St. Anthony's. He has degrees from Iowa State in philosophy and from Duke in divinity. So he knows what he's talking about. He enjoys doing it. And please help me welcome Will Hein.
Thank you, Dave. All right. Thank you, guys, for coming as well, and hello to people watching on YouTube either tonight or sometime when it's convenient for you when the kids are in bed. We're going to talk about the persecution of the early church tonight, and the reason why is it is so important and vital to the way that the church looked at itself, not only during those first 300 years of persecution, but it really shaped the identity of the church and how it interacted with the world for the next 1700 years when those persecutions stopped. In Romania, in June 2nd, little less than 2 weeks ago, Pope Francis was there, and he declared the beatification of 7 martyred Greek Catholic bishops. When Russia took over Romania in 1948 and stayed until 1970, they declared the Greek Catholic Church illegal. They seized all of its property, and anyone who had the gall to disagree with the Communist Party was thrown in jail, sometimes tortured, and some were killed, including these 7 bishops. One of the bishops who then died, his name was Iulu Hasu, and he said this while he was in prison. God has sent us into this darkness of suffering in order to offer forgiveness and to pray for the conversion of all. A rather remarkable sentiment considering the circumstance. There's an organization called Open Doors that tracks the persecution of Christianity today, and they put together a list of the worst places you could live in the world if you were a Christian, and continually at the top of the list is North Korea. North Korea, if they find out that you are a Christian, you could face either immediate execution or a prolonged execution in one of their labor camps. And not only that, but your entire family to the 4th generation will also meet your fate. The number of martyrs that have happened in the last 100 years surpasses the previous 1900 years combined. You can see numbers as high as 100,000 people are martyred a year for their faith. This number, I think, is extremely high. 7 to 10,000 is probably more likely, which is also a staggering number. If you decide to go into one of those echo chambers, I think is a good word for them, either online or certain news outlets or certain congregations, you will hear about the persecutions of Christians here in America, and how the, quote, liberal left is out to get Christianity, and make no mistake, Christians are being persecuted here in America as well. What I hope for everyone to get out of tonight's talk is I want to give you a very good grounding as to what actually happened to the early church in those first 250, 300 years. Because as I said, that is what created the identity of the church in its outlook towards persecution in the world for the next 1700 years up until today. And how we're going to do that is kind of an interesting way to do it. Is the first thing I want to do is actually look at it from the Roman perspective. Why were the Romans killing the Christians? What was in their mind when they were doing it? Then we'll flip things and we'll take a look at it from the Christian perspective as to why they were allowing themselves to be killed. We'll close with a few of the theological difficulties that's then posed for the church as to how to deal with the persecution happening to them, and then when things flip and they become in power. And I hope with all of this we have a good historical perspective, and we can then properly appreciate the martyrdoms that are happening today, both real and imagined. We should start by saying that the church was always persecuted. John the Baptist was beheaded during the ministry of Jesus. Jesus himself was predicting the persecution of the church. We read this in John 15, verses 18 through 20. If the world hates you, be aware it hated me before it hated you. If you belong to the world would love you as its own. Because you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word I said to you. Servants are not greater than their master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. And of course, Jesus was put to death by the Romans in the worst, most painful way that they knew how, crucifixion. The predictions continue. You can see one in 2 Timothy 3:12. Quote, indeed, all who want to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And the church was set up from the very beginning to be a persecuted minority. They were set up to be an antisocial group in relationship to the world. And it's very strange for people today to hear Christians being referred to as antisocial. Any church that I've ever been to has a myriad of social events throughout the week, often conflicting. You can't go to them all. We are at a social event right now. So the idea of Christians in the early church being antisocial needs a little bit of unpacking, and we will be doing that tonight. No sooner than chapter 5 in the book of Acts, we see the apostles arrested and thrown into prison by the high priest and the Sadducees. They were preaching Jesus resurrected and Jesus as the Messiah. In chapters 6 and 7, we have our first recorded instance of a Christian martyr, that being Stephen. Stephen is arrested for, quote, speaking blasphemous words against Moses and God. And then the next two chapters then go into a lengthy defense of Stephen, and it's kind of an interesting defense. What he does, as you know, is he gives a very brief, eloquent history of the Jewish people, spending a lot of attention on the Exodus and on Moses and various prophets from the Old Testament. When he finishes this history lesson, he ends with this extremely conciliatory outreached hand when he says this: you stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not prosecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become betrayers and murderers. You are the ones who received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it. Stephen was then taken outside of the city and stoned to death. And while he was dying, he uttered words in parallel with Jesus: forgive them and their sins, they know not what they do. The rest of the New Testament, Acts, talks about Paul constantly being thrown into jail. We hear it also in his letters that there is a constant irritation that the apostles are causing in the Jewish synagogues that are causing them to be thrown into jail. Why are the Jews so upset with the early Christians? We don't need to spend a lot of time on this because most people have grown up and they kind of get this, that what they were preaching about in Jesus ran against the grain for what the Jews believed about their faith. They were preaching Jesus as the Messiah. And there was a Messiah that was anticipated, but it was supposed to be a military Messiah, one who was going to overthrow the Romans, overthrow the persecutors, one who was going to reintroduce the nation of Israel as God's place here on earth. The apostles were preaching a crucified Messiah. They were also, of course, preaching that Jesus was God, which is the ultimate blasphemy, and that is why you have Jews expelling Christians from the synagogue so early. I think a good way to try to get inside that Jewish perspective is put a little thought experiment together that imagine that I was asked in here and I was going to tell you all about how Jesus was a Savior. And I'm telling you many things that sound right, but then there's several things that sound just a little off, where I tell you that Jesus came to earth to save us. And you would say, yes, he did. And I say, no, he wasn't born. He just appeared on earth. He didn't actually have a real body, but he came to earth. And you kind of shake your head at that. And then I went on to tell you that Jesus is God. Oh, yeah, but he's not the God of the Old Testament. That's a completely evil God, a sub-lesser God. Jesus is one of 30 gods and part of the good gods. Okay. And then I go on to tell you that you guys have 4 Gospels, and that's very nice for you. I have access to other Gospels written by the apostles that were secret teachings of Jesus, but you guys weren't worthy of them, but now I'm getting to share them with you. It would probably be at this point that Dave would come down and say, thank you for your time, Will, and escort me out, and that would be the last lecture I would ever give. This is the Jewish perspective. This is what the apostles are preaching, and the early Christians are preaching to the Jews. It is a blasphemy from their perspective. And therefore, the early Christian was expelled from the Jewish community. This had very, very important ramifications for the Christians. The Jews had a very interesting relationship with the Romans and the Roman state, in that they were tolerated and allowed to kind of do their thing. They're strange, they only worship one God, but hey, they do make offerings to their God for us, so we'll let them be. They're lazy, they don't work one day a week, but we'll let them be. They also have a very ancient religion, and they have these really ancient scriptures. And if there's one thing that the Romans could appreciate and respect, it was antiquity. Once the Jews got rid of the Christians, then the Christians left that protective umbrella of Judaism, and they're out on their own. And there's something that they, just as much as they love antiquity, they hate things that are new. So Christianity is not a religion to the Romans, it's a superstition. And even worse, it's a new superstition. We actually have a Roman historian named Suetonius who tells about this. He talks about in the year 49, during the reign of Claudius, he says, quote, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances, at the instigation of a Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome." What we have here is a little snippet letting us know that the Christians and the Jews were causing so much problems with each other, they were all expelled from Rome for a while in the year 49. So this is an outside source verifying the inside sources of Christianity of these expulsions. But now, just because it's a new suspicion, why would the Romans be so dead set against Christians? Especially when you consider that in the Christian scriptures, they actually go through a lot of lengths to try to ingratiate themselves with the state. When you read, especially in the Gospel of John, it is often the Jews who are responsible. And if you read, quickly, you would say, well, the Jews are the ones who crucified Jesus, not the Romans. The Jews had no authority to crucify anyone. The Romans are the ones who killed Christ. But you have very famous passages that get said over and over in the church's attempt to make nice with the Romans. Probably the most famous being Matthew 22:21, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's." It goes much more explicitly in Romans chapter 13, 1 through 7. Quote, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. Pay all what is due to them, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, and honor to whom honor is due. With that kind of attitude, how could the Christians ever run afoul with the authorities? Well, our first historical clue comes in the year of 64 with the Great Fire of Rome. On the night of July 19th, in the merchant shops near the Circus Maximus, a fire broke out, and that fire spread and spread and spread, and for 6 days it raged. They finally got it put out, only to see it reignite again and burn for another 3 days, and by the time the thing was done, 2/3 of Rome was in ruins. And people wanted to know, of course, what happened and why. Suspicion immediately started being cast upon the emperor of the time, Nero. He doesn't help things by taking the rubble and the places where things were destroyed and designate that spot as where he's going to build his brand new golden palace and start construction immediately. That doesn't help things. If you ever hear the famous phrase, Nero fiddled while Rome burned, there is a slanderous rumor, probably very much not true, that he sat on one of the 7 hills, played the lyre while watching Rome burn, composing a song about the sack of Troy. Nero found himself with public opinion turning against him. He needed a scapegoat, and so what does he do? He finds a group that is powerless, defenseless, and cannot stand up for themselves. He finds the Christians, an action that no politician would ever do today. Why the Christians? Well, it turns out Nero's wife, Poppaea, was sympathetic to Jews and to their thought, and so being a Jew and the Jews not having a very good relationship with Christians at this time, especially in Rome, it's thought that maybe she was the one who pointed out, here's a group to cast the suspicion upon. We have the writings of Tacitus, a Roman historian, and he says this about the reaction. Quote, "But all human efforts, all lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiation of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order." In other words, people thought that Rome was burned on Nero's orders. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Accordingly, an arrest was made, first of those who pleaded guilty, then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much for the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Stop here, and one of the things you're going to notice as we read more and more Roman sources is they really didn't have a clue who these Christians were. They had an idea, but there was a lot of, they had suspicions, they did abominable things, they do weird things at night, but they don't really have, the Roman aristocrats don't really know who these people are. Tacitus goes on. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skin of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or nailed to crosses, or were doomed to flames and burnt, to serve as nightly illumination when daylight expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but for the glut of one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. They were treated so badly, people felt bad for them. Tacitus is very clear, though. They felt like they should die, just not this bad, to placate this evil man. It is thought that in the aftermath of this is also when Paul and Peter were killed in Rome. Paul being beheaded because he was a citizen, Peter being crucified. The story goes he was crucified upside down, not, by the way, because he did not want to imitate Jesus, as most people think, it was actually because he wanted to be upside down to symbolize the fall of Adam and how that turned everything upside down, and him being crucified upside down was symbolic of the forgiveness and the repentance that comes from Christianity and for Christ. But a line had now been drawn that Christianity was now illegal, technically speaking, in the empire. But that needs a little unpacking as well, because if something's, quote, illegal in the empire, it's more of a suggestion. Doesn't really matter. But it matters enough that the missionary efforts really kind of go underground, and the big missionaries like Paul totally cease to exist in the record. But Rome was just Rome. Even though it was the emperor who ordered this, it was only happening in Rome. This was not an empire-wide persecution of all the Christians. And it did not continue ad infinitum. It was for a very short period of time. And, to be technically correct, they were being killed for arson, not for being Christians. But it still doesn't quite explain why they were being killed and persecuted thereafter. The next clue we get from the Roman record comes from 111. And this is actually the very first mention, chronologically speaking, of Christians by a Roman source. 111. People usually are kind of surprised by that. Wouldn't have all the Romans have known about Jesus before this time? And the answer is no. They had no idea what this was, never really felt it to be worth mentioning in their histories. But in 111, a man by the name of Pliny the Younger was assigned to be the governor of Bithynia, which is in modern-day Turkey. And whenever he ran into a problem, he would write the emperor, who at this time's name was Trajan. And he would say, hey, this is going on, what do you suggest? And Trajan would write back and give him some guidance as to how to proceed. And Pliny, luckily for us, took all this correspondence and he published it. And that's why it came down to us in posterity. And one of the letters that he wrote is of great importance to us tonight, because Pliny starts to describe to Trajan that he's in the middle of a persecution of Christians and he wants Trajan's advice. And Pliny basically lays out what he's doing and says, what do you think? Pliny says that there has been all these mobs bringing Christians forward and denouncing them as Christians, and so I bring them in for a tribunal and I bring them in front of me and I say, are you a Christian? If they say yes, I tell them, you need to sacrifice to the gods and you need to curse Christ. If they still say I'm a Christian, I give them a third option and I say, if you do not do what I say, you will be executed. If they continue to persist in calling themselves Christians and not sacrificing to the gods and not cursing Christ, I execute them. Not necessarily even for being Christian, but just for being obstinate. That if someone is like this, they are not a good Roman citizen. Pliny, though, wants to know, should I be making a distinction between men, women, old people, young people? What do you think in terms of my modus operandi? The good news is before this persecution broke out, the temples were in derelict. Nobody was going to the temples and no one was visiting the butcher shops. Now that this persecution is going on, the temples are being visited again. Why does that matter? Christians were antisocial. They would not partake in the normal day-to-day activities that the Romans would. Why? There was such a blending between normal life and religious life back then, it was hard to separate. And a good Christian could not, in good conscience, go to the temple and participate in a festival, because it's a festival to a Roman god. They could not go to the butcher shop and buy meat, because 95% of the food that's available at the butcher shop is the result of sacrifices that were happening at the temple. So their thought is these mobs were getting very angry that business was down. Why is business down? Because of the Christians. He also lets Trajan know that there's all these weird rumors about them. They meet at night, and there's a lot of stuff going on. I've taken the time to torture some of the Christian slaves to get to the bottom of it. Turns out it's just a bunch of superstition. They're just eating a feast. It's not a big deal. It's kind of interesting that he tortures the slaves to get to the bottom of it. The Romans had a very different understanding of pain than we did. Romans thought that if you are under extreme pain, that brings you closest to the truth. Today, any expert, not politician, any expert would tell you torture does not give you a good insight into what's actually going on. Trajan's reply is interesting. He basically tells Pliny, good job. You're doing a good job. Keep it up. 2 suggestions. 1, you're not allowed to accept any anonymous claims about someone being a Christian. No one can just write on a placard, put it up in the town hall saying, Suganis is a Christian, and then you have to bring in Suganis. It has to be a face-to-face accusation. Second, and even more importantly, do not seek the Christians out. If someone's denounced, deal with it, but don't go looking for them. Leave them alone otherwise. And this is exactly what is going on with Roman persecution all the way up through the year 250. It is local, sporadic, short-termed, and usually induced by the mobs. But we're still not answering the question as to why. Well, I'd like to do a little thought experiment with you by reading you some ancient scriptures from some different religions. Instead of drinking tea, they didn't have tea back then, we're all at one of the bathhouses or we're at one of the taverns enjoying some nice Italian wine, and I'm going to tell you about this crazy religion I've heard about in Babylon. And I've got some actual scriptures from Babylon about this religion, and wait till you hear about this. And then I'm going to read you this, and this is an actual quote. This is a creation story. Nintu said to the divine assembly, I cannot do Ea Inca's work. Only Ea Inca has the power to create. Let him give me clay to create. Ea Inca spoke. I will bathe to mark time. At the new moon, the 7th day, and the full moon, I will wash. Let the divine assembly sacrifice Wi Ila. Let them bathe in his blood. Let Nintu thin my clay with his blood. Let Nintu mix clay with the blood, human and divine. Let the drum mark off the days, count down the time. Let the divine blood give these workers life. Let the spirit within allow them to live. The divine assembly agreed. The divine elders consented. Well, that's interesting. I have no answers as to who Ela is and why he was the one who got killed. I don't know why the bathing is going on repetitively and what the drum means, but we could think of some interesting things. But here's another good one. This is an actual quote. Unas is the bull of heaven who rages in his heart, who lives on the being of every god, who eats their entrails. When they come, their bodies full of magic from the Isle of Flame, Khonsu slaughters the lords, cuts their throats for Unas, and takes out for him what is in their bellies. He is the messenger whom he sends out to chastise. Indeed, Shesmu cuts them up for Unas and cooks for him a meal out of his evening pots. Unas is he who eats their magic, who swallows their spirits. Their great ones are for his morning meal, their middle ones for his evening meal, their little ones for his night meal, the old men and women are his fuel. End quote. Oh, and here's this too. So they've got 4 gods, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, and they marry each other because they've got no one else, but the 2 brothers get in a fight and the one brother gets killed. And then he gets chopped up into 14 pieces and gets spread all around. Well, the wife/sister of the dead one is really sad, goes and finds the 14 pieces, puts them back together, has sex with the dead body, gets pregnant, and then gives birth to a son who then goes on to challenge his uncle and beats him, and then he's the reigning god. So then, with several more glasses of wine, we could come up with who these people are, how they practice, and what kind of religion this could possibly be. And then we go out and we go to different parties, and you want to be the center of attention. You're like, I've got to tell you what I just learned about. And so you kind of start reciting it. It's like telephone, and what you're able to tell them is not quite what I told you, and you want to make it a good yarn, so you embellish a little bit here and there. And all of a sudden, if you ran across one of these people on the street who worship this, you'd cross to the other side of the street. This is what happened with the Christians. The Christians were very secretive. People didn't know who they were and what they worshiped. They never hung out with anybody. They met at night. You had to go through at least a 3-year catechesis period, unlike the 6 weeks I did with Dave, to join the church and be baptized. So unless you're baptized, you leave when this special magic stuff happens. When the Eucharist happens, you don't know what's there. So you have Romans then who are going to hear this quote, and they'll play the game that I just proposed. Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. John 6:53 through 56. The Romans were grasping in the dark as to who these people were. They would hear rumors, and they would let their imaginations run wild. And I'm going to read you some of the actual rumors that the Romans thought the Christians were doing. And this is not just from one text, so I can give you direct quotes, but we know that these rumors were empire-wide. We know this because they were then answered by Christians throughout the centuries, and these Christian apologists would be writing, trying to debunk these myths, saying, this is not us, this is not what we do. They would have to deal with things like, everybody knows that Christianity is a lust religion where they all get together and have sex with their brothers and sisters. It's incestuous. They worship the genitals of their pontiff and their priests. For the initiation for Christianity, they would take a live baby, put it in a huge bowl, and cover it with flour. Then the person to be initiated would come and beat on the flour until the baby is dead. Then they would all come around, tear up the baby, and eat the baby. After this, they would get crazy drunk. They would tie the tails of a dog to a lamppost. That's the thing that's lighting everything because it's dark. They throw meat out. The dog runs after the meat, thus turning over the lamp, turning off the lights, and then the orgy starts. That's Christianity. Not surprisingly, Athenagoras, one of the early church apologists, said in one of his letters, if anything that you have read about us is true, we deserve to all die. But it's not. But how would the Romans even come to this kind of concept? Well, Christians would call each other brother and sister. They greeted each other with the holy kiss, and the holy kiss was a kiss on the mouth. It stopped there, but the Romans don't know that. They claim to eat the blood, or eat the flesh and drink the blood of the Son of God. Thus these thespian, cannibalistic feasts. They kneel before their priest to be blessed, and when you're kneeling, I guess you're in the genital-like area, and thus the worship. You can see how these things would fuel the imagination of the Romans. And time after time, the Christians would say, this is not us, and they would let them in enough to let them know this is not us. But there was one accusation against the Christians that they could not shake because it was true. That is that the Christians, according to the Romans, were atheists. Which to our modern sensibilities doesn't make any sense. How can a Christian be an atheist? Well, from the Roman perspective, they don't believe in the Roman gods. And if you don't believe in all the Roman gods, you're an atheist. You don't believe in the gods. So they're not making the distinction between believing in one God. Well, why does that matter? The Romans were, contrary to what we're talking about tonight, an extremely tolerant people when it came to religion. They really cared less what you worshiped. When they went and they conquered you, in self-defense as they would put it, they would bring in their gods, but they wouldn't get rid of yours. They would just kind of bring them into the pantheon, or they would say, who's your mean god? Zeus? Well, Zeus is a lot like Jupiter, so they're kind of the same, and they would all kind of get mixed in. Rome also was huge at this time. From Britain down to North Africa, over to Egypt, Syria, the Balkans, Asia Minor, France, up into the Rhineland. What tied all of these people together was their imperial cult. And people had no problem with the imperial cult. If you conquered us, Romans, your gods are better than ours. We can still worship ours? Cool. Oh, but yeah, we'll worship yours. I mean, they're obviously real. We lost. You won. And they would have no problem then making an offering to the imperial cult. The Christians, as you would expect, had a problem with this. The other thing to keep in mind is Roman religion, and almost every religion at the time, was a transactional religion. That means it doesn't matter what you believe, it matters what you do. The gods don't care what you think of them, they care that you come to the festival. They care that the temples are populated, they care that the sacrifices are being correctly done. If that's done, benevolence is showed on you. If it's not done, their wrath is shown on you. So if there is a famine, why is there a famine? Well, the gods must not be sacrificed to. Well, who's not sacrificing to the gods? The Christians. The Christians are the reason why there's a famine. Why was there an earthquake? Why was there fill in the blank? We actually have this wonderful quote from the church father Tertullian. He wrote this: "The Christians are to blame for every public disaster and every misfortune that befalls the people. If the Tiber rises to the walls, if the Nile fails to rise and flood the fields, if the sky withholds its rain, if there's an earthquake or a famine or a plague, straightway the cry arises, 'The Christians to the lions.'" They would then be taken by the mob, and a trial would proceed, and basically, like we already talked about with Pliny, are you a Christian? And we have a lot of these transcripts come down to us. In some ways, if you read them from the right frame of mind, you feel bad for the Romans because you actually have transcripts like this. State your name for the record. I am a Christian. Yeah, that wasn't the question. What's your name? I'm a Christian. Okay, moving on, Licinius. I see that you are married to Petunia. Is that correct? I am a Christian. And on it would go. They want to answer a single question. They would just keep saying, I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian, I'm a Christian, until off with their head just for being obstinate already. The Christians were given all these chances of, look, consider how old you are. Just pour a little incense here, do a little of this, do a little of that. Just come on, man. We know how transactional this is, and we know how many attempts were given because we actually have accounts of people saying, I'm a Christian, and refusing to just burn a little incense or pour out a little oil. And they're on their last chance, and their friends and family who are not Christian are there at the trial. And they physically come and pick them up, carry them over, and make them drop a little bit of oil. Meanwhile, the guy's screaming or the woman's screaming, no, this is not me, I'm a Christian, no. They put them down, and the governor looks at it, sees the oil's on the ground, he goes, check, next, and that person's allowed free, screaming, no, I'm a Christian. From the Roman perspective, the sacrifice was done. From the Christian perspective, what have you just made me do? So these trials are where we get the term martyr, by the way. A martyr is someone who originally in a legal trial was one who to bear witness. And there were so many Christians then bearing witness to their faith that the term got attached to them and ceased to lead any other kind of meaning for people. We also have in a lot of these, you have to be careful when you read the martyrologies because almost every single one of them are written hundreds of years later. They have a polemical, theological viewpoint, and you can get some historical factoids out there, but not many. But they do make for some really good reading. There's one guy named Lawrence was being roasted on a griddle, and he supposedly said to his torturers, you can turn me over now, start cooking the other side, and see how your fire god's done, and take a bite. It's a great line. No way that it would have happened while being roasted alive. So let's switch then to the Christian viewpoint as to if all you had to do was drop a little oil or burn a little incense, why instead were you allowing yourself to be roasted alive? I'm going to read you a couple quotes from one of the persecutions that we have a long letter from that actually has a lot of good historical reliable information. It comes from the Church of Lyon in modern-day France in the 2nd century. We don't know why it started. It was mob-induced again, and people were again brought into the proconsuls or the governors or the people in charge at the time, and they went through the typical thing of, are you a Christian? Yes. Step to the side, you're about to be executed. And this went on. And Vitius, who is one of the church leaders, was not one of the ones originally arrested, and he's kind of standing off to the side, just seeing friend after friend being sent off to be tortured and then executed. He steps forward and he goes, You're not even letting them answer the questions and deal with the charges. You're just immediately executing them when they say that they admit that they're a Christian. To which the governor goes, "You sound a lot like a Christian." "Well, I am." Off to the side to be executed. Blandina was there, and she was a woman, a leader of the church, and the Romans really wanted to make an example out of her. And we hear this about her, and this is a quote from the letter recounting what happened during that terrible time. "Blandina was filled with such power that those who took it in turns to subject her to every kind of torture from morning to night were exhausted by their efforts and confessed themselves beaten. They could think of nothing else to do to her. They were amazed she was still breathing, for her whole body was mangled and her wounds gaped. They declared that the torment of any one kind that they subjected her to would be enough to part the soul from the body, let alone the succession of torments of such severity. But the blessed woman, wrestling magnificently, grew in strength as she proclaimed her faith, and found refreshment, rest, and insensibility to her sufferings in uttering the words, 'I am a Christian.'" And this went on, day after day. Blandina was brought into the public arena to be tortured again and again for the amusement of those in Lyon. Quote goes on, "This was the greatest war they, the martyrs, fought against him through the reality of their love, that the beast might be choked into bringing up alive those whom he thought he had swallowed already. This they shared with their neighbors when triumphantly, victoriously, they departed to God." There's a lot to look at in that last passage because it gives us a clue as to then how the Christians started to understand what was happening to them. You can imagine the shell shock. Even if this is sporadic and you're not the one it happened to, you might have witnessed it or heard about it, and it would have very much shaken you to the core. And the theological understanding that they put upon the events was to view themselves in a cosmic struggle. The people who are persecuting us are not the Romans. They're the demons. This is light versus dark. When I'm being asked to sacrifice to one of these idols, it's not an empty idol. They're not looking at that as, oh, that statue of Jupiter. Jupiter doesn't exist. That's a demon putting on the mask of Jupiter to deceive people. So if I were to burn incense to that, I'm burning incense to a demon and thus sending my soul to hell. It's a very difficult thing, though, that when you start looking at people as no longer people and start looking at them as demonic forces. If you are locked in a cosmic war, they do what anyone does in war. You demonize the other person on the other side of the line. They view themselves as the sword of God striking a blow against the devil. But there's also an edge to these people, some of them. There's a quote from one of the martyrs in Lyon named Saturus, and he yells at the crowd as he's being tortured and soon about to be devoured by the wild beasts, "Take a good look at our faces so that you will be able to recognize us on that day." What day is he talking about? He's talking about the final judgment. He wants these people to know that when the final judgment comes, the table is going to be turned. I'm sitting on the throne of God, and it's your turn to be suffering the fires. And my temporary execution is nothing like yours, which is going to be everlasting. Kind of a ha-ha moment. Tertullian makes the same kind of statement, quote, "At what shall I laugh when I see so many kings who were proclaimed to have been taken up into heaven groaning in the deepest darkness? And when I see those governors, persecutors of the Lord's name, melting in the flames more savage than those which they instantly raged against the Christians." So for every Stephen and every Jesus praying, "Forgive them, they know not what they do," there's quite a few other martyrs who are kind of looking forward to the comeuppance that is to come. We also have to understand how martyrdom was then starting to be viewed. It was kind of unclear for the early church what exactly happened when you die. Do you go straight to heaven? Do you go to sleep until the last judgment? Are you kind of in a purgatory? The jury was out as to what happened. We all knew that at the end, eventually, there's the resurrection of the body and there's the paradise, but what's in between? We don't know. We do know that if you are martyred for Christ, it's a straight ticket to heaven. The moment you die, you're immediately there with God, and the worse you suffered, the more glorious your crown. This leads to the problem of people volunteering for martyrdom, and we'll come back to that. We should also, real quick, one more fun quote from Tertullian. He's the one who famously said that martyrs' blood are the seed of the church. That there's kind of that notion that, boy, these Romans watching this and these people just suffering day after day, that had to lead to a lot of people converting to Christianity. And it's a nice thought, but it's probably not true. I'm sure there was a few people who were kind of interested, but Rome was a very violent society, and this was their entertainment. And the Christians coming out and dying was just part of the bill that day of watching other people die. And they really didn't care that much of who they were and why they were dying. And when they find out that they're dying for their God, their response would have been this: not much of a powerful God now, is it? We have in the letters of Ignatius a wonderful insight into the mind of someone who's about to be martyred. He was the bishop of Antioch at the turn of the 2nd century, and he was arrested, we don't know why, and he was transported to Rome to be executed. We don't know why they were doing it in Rome. But along the way, he was given the chance, and he wrote several letters to several different churches, and these letters have survived. Included in this is a letter to Rome. And in that letter, he basically begs the church there not to intercede in his behalf. He says this: "If you are silent concerning me, I shall become God's. But if you show your love towards my flesh, I shall have to run my race again. Suffer me to become food for the wild beasts, through whose instrumentality it will be granted me to attain to God. I am the wheat of God, and let me be ground by the teeth of the wild beasts, that I may be found the pure bread of Christ. Rather entice the wild beasts, that they may become my tomb, and may leave nothing of my body, so that when I have fallen asleep, I may be of no trouble to anyone. Then shall I truly be a disciple of Christ. Let fire and the cross, let the crowds of the wild beasts, breaking and tearing and separation of bones, let cutting off of members, let bruising to pieces of the whole body, let the very torment of the devil come upon me, only let me attain to Jesus Christ. Permit me to be an imitator of the passion of my God." The martyrs viewed themselves as the imitation of Christ. As Christ died for the church, I will die for Christ. Some theological issues come up with martyrdom. We talked about one before. What do you do about voluntary martyrs? And the literature is a little split on this from the time. Most of the theologians are kind of like, that's not what you should do. If we follow Jesus' example, he didn't walk up to the high priest and surrender himself. He went to the Garden of Gethsemane. They came and they took him, and he willingly went, but he wasn't seeking it out. And there's a lot of theological arguments about don't resist, but don't seek it out either. There's also cases of people going, saying, I'm a Christian, and then under torture recounting, and they're like, you're just tempting the devil there. But there's also lots of instances where someone would go up and say, I'm a Christian too, and go and suffer for them, and then they are also praised. So what do you do with voluntary martyrs? There's also this wonderful story in 185 in Turkey where a whole mob of Christians go to the governor's palace, bang on the door in the middle of the night, screaming, we are Christians, execute us. The governor's response, there's plenty of cliffs to jump off of and rope to hang yourself. I have more important pressing matters if you don't mind. An interesting story, though, because if Christians were illegal all the time, everywhere, they would have been killed. But for the most part, again, they were left to their own devices. What do you do when you have someone who is in prison, being tortured, and political winds shift, as they often do, and then they're released? These became holy men and holy women who were referred to as confessors, people who confessed Christ. These people were as close as you could possibly get to heaven on earth, because they were almost there. And then they were sought out by those who had lapsed and asked for forgiveness. They were sought out for spiritual advice. They were sought out as leaders of the church. As you can imagine, a bishop might not be too happy about this after a while. As the bishop, I'm the one who's supposed to forgive you. As the bishop, I know the correct ins and outs of the faith. Yes, Licinius there is a very holy person, but he doesn't quite get all the intricacies of the theology like I do, and there now becomes a little bit of a struggle for authority in the church. What do you do with those who lapse? That's a problem. They want to come back to the church, and they actually come up with different rules and different standards as to what you do with those who lapsed. If you lapsed under torture, 40 days of penance and then you're back in. It's okay. If you lapsed under threat of torture, well then, you know what, 3 years and 40 days. Because you just, and they actually would set it up, depending on how bad your lapsing was, what you had to do to get back in. But the thorny issue is, what do you do with a bishop who lapses? Everybody agreed if a bishop lapses, you shouldn't hold the office anymore. The priest shouldn't hold the office anymore. Okay, well and good. But what happens if the bishop lapses and people don't know about it, and then continues to carry on with their office after being released from prison? What happens if that's now a fallen bishop and he goes and consecrates a priest or another bishop, and he starts to perform baptisms? These are being done by someone who's no longer a bishop. Do these people need to be reconsecrated, rebaptized? It's an interesting question, and I'm not going to answer it tonight because it took the church hundreds of years of wrestling with it. So we'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow. You also have the adoration of relics. When the martyrs died, these were holy men and women. And you have a lot of examples of the Romans doing everything they could to leave nothing of the body so that people wouldn't come in and create these superstitions and take these and have these holy relics. But when they could, they would go and they would gather everything that they could, and then these relics were viewed as having special powers. They had healing powers. If you were buried even in the same cemetery as a martyr, you had the chance of going straight to heaven just because of the proximity of your burial. As the Christian took over the empire and the temples stopped being places of pilgrimage, new ones were arising, Christian ones, to the martyrs of where they died. And the map of Rome, or the Roman Empire, I should say, changed drastically as to where people would go. They would no longer go to Delphi. They would go to, I'm blanking on the place in France. So fill in the blank where so-and-so died. So let's come to this conclusion, speaking of Constantine and coming to the end. The persecution of the church was no means an immersive experience for everyone at all times. In 250, that changes. In 250, an emperor comes to power named Decius, and he declares that everybody needs to sacrifice to the imperial cult. And if you don't, you're going to be killed. And many people were killed. Fabian, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was killed during this persecution. But it only lasted for a year before Decius was dead, and the new emperor thought there were more pressing things to do. In 257, Valerian came to power, and he, for the first time, declared Christianity itself illegal in the entire empire. All churches are to be closed and burned. All bishops and priests are to be executed immediately. All aristocratic Christians lose all of their property and their special social status. Now that's very interesting because just 6 years before that, a persecution of the Christians just came about, and so there's still senators and aristocrats and governors in very high places that are Christian. It gives you a clue that the persecution were never that widespread at this point. Valerian also died, much to the happy feelings of the Christians. He was captured by the Persians during a war. He was made to be the footstool of the king of Persia for a while until he got tired of humiliating that way and had him flayed alive. The Christians, of course, thought this was great comeuppance for his crimes. But then another 40 years of peace occurred for the church. We know there's 40 years of peace because no persecutions broke out. It was so good for the Christians that in 285 in Antioch, they deposed their bishop, Paul of Samosata, and Paul of Samosata refused to accept the fact that he was deposed. He viewed the church as his own personal church and his own personal property. He said, I don't care if you think I'm your bishop anymore. I'm selling the church and I'm keeping the property. The congregation appealed directly to the emperor Aurelian. Aurelian, if the normal story that you know is correct, would have killed them all for admitting publicly that they were Christians. Instead, what you have is the very first instance of the church appealing to the emperor. And the emperor adjudicated the case, found in favor of the congregation, and kicked Paul out. But this all ends in 303 with what is referred to as the Great Persecution. In 9 years, more Christians are killed than the previous persecutions all combined. And we will talk about that tomorrow with the introduction of Constantine and what he meant to the church. But bringing it back to this, we can understand why the Christians would react the way they did. Why would they start to dehumanize and demonize those who are attacking them? It's the natural response. The question that it leaves for the church is what happens when the church stops being a persecuted minority and starts becoming the powerful majority. What happens to that viewpoint of the other who disagrees with you as being demonic and not correct? What happens when the church, you go through a 3-year catechesis to become a member of the church, to profess your Christianity, and knowing to do so could lead to your death? To now, it is commonly accepted, and it's the way actually to get a promotion. One final thought. I've stayed, for the most part, away from some of the macabre and gruesome details of the tortures and deaths that the Christians underwent. The Romans had great imagination when it came to inflicting pain. But I would like to read you a quote, again from Leon, about something that Sanctus suffered. He had been tortured for several days, and then, quote, they ended by pressing red-hot copper plates against the most sensitive parts of his body. These were burning. But Sanctus remained unbending and unyielding, firm in his confession of faith, bedded and fortified by the heavenly fountain of water of life that flows from the depths of Christ's being. But his poor body was a witness to what he had suffered. It was all one wound and bruise, bent and robbed of outward human shape. But suffering in that body, Christ accomplished most glorious things, utterly defeating the adversary and proving as an example to the rest that where the Father's love is, nothing can frighten us. Where Christ's glory is, nothing can hurt us. I believe historical context matters. I believe that words matter. Sanctus bared witness to his belief that Jesus is Lord. 7,000 to 10,000 people a year in the modern world are bearing witness and suffering much like Sanctus and Blandina and others that we've talked about for their belief that Jesus is Lord. I think words matter. And so I would just end with this question. Are we correct when we use the word persecution when someone's asked to bake a cake? Thank you. And of course, if you guys have any questions or want me to go into any more gruesome detail, I'd be more than happy to if I haven't bummed you out enough already. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you at home as well, and thank you, Dave, for giving me the time.
So again, if we'll be here tomorrow night again at 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and then hold on one second. Then and if you have people who weren't able to make it tonight, it is, like I said, recorded, so they can watch it on our website. So just come to St. Anthony's website; it's all right there. So, do you want to do you have a question, Mary?
You know, it just sounds like very much when you think about the early Christians and how limited maybe their theological understanding of the mysteries and that of Christ, and yet they died willingly. And you wonder, you know, what, I guess I'm just surprised, not surprised, but at that level of understanding, I mean, the terrific commitment they had.
It's a little bit of a spoiler for tomorrow, but it's a very good point that to become a Christian in the early church, you're not meeting in beautiful places like this. You're meeting in someone's house with 20, 30, 40 people. And Christians knew that the way to properly do mission work, when they kind of had to go underground, if you will, was the way that they lived their life. And it was kind of a bottom-up approach of showing people how to live and what it meant to be a Christian and the risk that it meant as well. And so for you to be a Christian, be baptized, you went through rigorous training for a very, very long time. And so you were sure what it meant to be a Christian when you said those words and you were baptized. And so, yes, the dedication is remarkable. That being said, there were a lot of people who lapsed. Probably the majority of people did. They were human, all too human. And the martyrs who did pay the ultimate price, they had a bravery that few men and women know. But, and I would also say, they were very sophisticated in their understanding of the theological mysteries. We often, theologians often say that they are standing on the shoulders of giants when they are doing their work, and that you go and try to read through Augustine's The Trinity, and you're going to take a couple weeks. And that's not even getting into some of the Greek fathers and the way that they were able to parse things and things like that. It was very sophisticated, and they were very, very clever. But it's a very, very good point. And we'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow, too. Yeah. No, it's a great question. You're absolutely right. In the first couple centuries, there was debate going as to what actually the Trinity was, who Jesus was, what was Jesus' relationship with the Father. I would love to have been alive in the 2nd century, or at least I wish we had so much more writings. I wouldn't actually wanted to have lived there, but I wish we had so many more writings of the 2nd century, because that's when Christianity was the Wild West. That you want to believe anything you want, there's a church for you that believes that. So, yes, there is the question of, if there's all these different beliefs being bandied about, did that have something to do with persecution? And the answer is yes. Sometimes there would be certain sects of Christians who would act and behave a certain type of way that the Romans were going to be much more inclined to view them as rebel rousers as opposed to others. I think the sadder answer to your question, and something we'll get into again tomorrow, is what happens when the Christians come into power, and then there's some Christians over here who say that they're Christian, but in a different way. how are they then treated? And spoiler alert, not well. It also should be pointed out that there were other religions floating around that was not being persecuted. There was something called Manichaeism at the time that some people thought was off. And that would take another hour to explain what that was. But it was persecuted as well. Way back in 294, it was attempted to be eradicated. So the persecution was not, the Druids were eradicated as well. So there's other religions around also suffering persecution. We just don't know as much about them because they didn't win out in the end, if you will. Yeah.
Where did the growth in the early church come from? Slaves, citizens, upper class, lower class? What was the average church member?
Lower class. Lower class. The question was, when the growth of the church, where did the converts come from? There are a few exceptional examples of someone who's a more upper class person. Typically, the more upper class or wealthier person, it was their house that then they would meet in. But Christianity, for the most part, was appealing to the uneducated masses. The Christian church was very unique in its approach to the masses, that as much as people hated the Christians, they did recognize their charity, that they were the ones who the Romans would abandon their children. If you had a baby and you didn't want it, or was deformed, you would expose the child. You would put it out in a public place or out in the woods. The gods would take care of it. And so it's on the gods' conscience, not mine, or someone might come and pick up the child. The Christians were constantly bringing in exposed children. They were known for their charity, for giving to the poor, for giving to widows. And this, of course, then expanded their numbers for those they were being charitable to. But who are they being charitable to? The downtrodden. In the 3rd century, end of the 2nd century, you do start to see a shift in more and more educated Romans start becoming Christians. So the apologists that I referred to before, these are people who could speak Greek and Latin very well, who could intellectually argue with the Platonists and the pagans around, and could actually make a justifiable defense. So the apologists are defenders of the faith, not saying I'm sorry. So it does start to creep up more and more as time goes on. But really, it's not until the conversion of Constantine tomorrow night that there's a flood of the educated elite coming in. So with that, I hope to see you guys tomorrow night or online tomorrow night. Thank you, guys.